Most people, when they hear the topic of Islam, their very first reaction is, it doesn't really affect me much. Yeah, I know that there are things going on in the Middle East. I hear news accounts about wars. I hear about particular cities over there, whether it be Iraq, Afghanistan. But deep down, we feel like that's there, I'm here. Why do I need to know anything about it? After all, I spend most of my time in the Cookeville, Gainesboro area. And yet the reality is, if you think about it, it's coming a lot closer to home. This is a picture of the mosque in Murfreesboro, Tennessee, just down I-40, I-24. Was built, was opened, and now what are they doing? They're wanting to build another one. Some of you recognize the mall that we used to call Hickory Hollow Mall in Nashville. They're wanting to add another mosque there, wanting to add a cemetery. And so little by little, things are starting to creep this way. In fact, those of you know anything about the way Islam is working today, you know that they love to build these in college towns. Obviously, Cookeville being one of those. So we ask the question, all right, what exactly do we need to know today? I want us to kind of step back, take an overview, and try to get a good picture of what these folks are really doing, because in all honesty, they're trying to reach out to our kids. They're actually trying to evangelize Christians. This is a web shot from one of their evangelistic outreaches. It's called Chrislam. It's the idea that you can have Christ and Islam together. Now, it's totally bogus. They honestly don't want you to retain Christ, but it's a way in which they can come to a college campus and say, hey, you can have both. Join us. But again, you look at me and you say, Brad, I hear what you're saying, but my kids are not going to fall for that. That's not really going to affect us here. Let me ask you, just how much have your kids already been taught? Just how tolerant are they of this particular belief system? Because, folks, believe it or not, it is in a lot of the textbooks. It's actually got an enormous amount of material in this New Common Core. On the screen behind me is a world history book, Across the Centuries. Now, think with me for just a moment. If I were teaching your child about world history, things like Egypt, things like the Aztecs, if we were to open up that textbook, do you think Islam needs to be the second unit that they cover? And the reason that I point this out is because most teachers in this room know, you usually get through the first few chapters of the textbooks without any problem. Usually somewhere around March or April, though, you realize, I'm not going to finish it, and so you kind of hurry through the stuff that you have to cover for exams. But you always get through those first few chapters, and it's in those first few chapters that they are actually teaching our kids about Muhammad, Islam. Now, again, we got to ask this question. If it is a history book, and this thing started roughly, you think about comparing it to something like Jews. Why aren't the Jews long before Islam? You see, the reality is they're trying to change the way our kids look at this belief system, alter their worldview. We talked a little bit yesterday about what a worldview is. Remember, a worldview is something basically that details how we perceive our environment. Everybody in this room, right now, you've got a worldview. Your worldview is shaped by things like your education, your religious experiences, your environment, everything that you've done. It helps us to answer those important questions, but understand that your worldview alters the way you look at stuff. So if I've been taught since I was in first grade that Islam is something that I should embrace, that it's a good thing, that I'm going to look at it differently from somebody who maybe has grown up realizing that this particular religion has some violence to it. I've used the picture behind me just to kind of make the point. Two people can look at the exact same thing, and because they are looking at it from different worldviews, they can actually come away with a different perspective. You know, maybe one of these people in this picture grew up as an orphan, or maybe one of them is colorblind. The bottom line is they can look at exactly the same thing and come away with a different picture. The perfect example of this, to me, is 9/11. If I were to ask you in this room, is 9/11 a good thing or a bad thing? I think 100% of us in this room would say that was a bad thing. But interesting, if I were to go to a group of Muslims and ask them the same question, because of their worldview, they view it differently than we do. So what I want us to do is I want us to look at the Islamic worldview a little bit today. I do hope that you'll maybe jot down a couple of notes, that you will remember some of this, because in all reality, if you think about it, as I mentioned yesterday, our worldview affects every aspect of our life. And the problem, as I see it, is this is not just a religion. Islam is a political movement. It's one thing for us to say we have freedom of religion in the United States of America. Amen, that's true. But folks, there's a problem when a group of people, they want to bring in not just their religion, but also a political movement. If you think back with me 30, 40 years ago, for the most part, we were pretty ignorant, apathetic about Islam. We didn't know, didn't care. And then, about 1979, some of you may remember the Iran hostage situation. A fellow by the name of Ayatollah Khomeini was in charge at that time. What most Americans did not realize is that name, that Ayatollah, actually represents a high-ranking Islamic official. We found out in 1979 that there's people over there, number one, not only did they not believe like us, they didn't really like us. Well, that was in 1979. A couple of years later, 1983, you may remember that the Marine barracks, the embassy in Lebanon, were blown up. Literally, kind of out of the blue. And it was Islam who was taking credit for it. A few years after that, 1988, there was a Pan Am flight from Lockerbie, Scotland. Blew up just after takeoff. And again, it was Islam taking credit for that. And all of a sudden, we're kind of scratching our heads wondering, what's going on? Why would these people do that? Honestly, Americans were looking at it like, why would they do such a radical thing? Because after all, we don't even consider doing something like that. That was in 1988. The year 2000, one of our Navy ships, the USS Cole, was bombed, killing several Navy men. And again, it was Islam taking credit for it. But I think the thing that really changed everybody, the thing that kind of collectively woke us up, was 9/11. World Trade Centers were flown into by planes, the Pentagon, and all of a sudden, we had questions. We wanted to know, who are these people? What are they doing? What's this word jihad? And are the Muslims in America the same as the ones over in the Middle East? What's this term sleeper cells that we're hearing about? And suddenly everybody collectively wanted to know more about this belief system. It was really 9/11 that kind of helped us to lift our head out of the sand, and we started looking around and we realized that the landscape of America had changed dramatically over the last few decades. For instance, let me give you a couple of examples. Here you see a picture, Keith Ellison, one of the congressmen, being sworn into office in Washington, D.C. The only problem is, instead of placing his hand on a Bible like every single congressman before him, he placed his hand on the Quran. Or maybe you might remember them wanting to build a mosque at Ground Zero. And there were whisperings that this was not a mosque, a place for them to meet, but rather kind of a victory center, a celebration of what they had done at that location. And then in roughly 2009, the president appointed 2 Muslims to key positions in the Department of Homeland Security, and all of a sudden, literally, we kind of collectively said, wait a second, what's going on? Who are these people? If you look on the screen behind me, you'll notice that I put up a comparison of Islam, down here at the bottom row, and Christianity. And interesting, on this first screen, they match up pretty much the same. When it comes to theology, we both believe in a single God. Now, I'll talk a little bit in just a moment about the fact that our God and their Allah are different, but monotheism. When it comes to philosophy, we both believe in the supernatural, that there is a spirit that goes on after death. When it comes to biology, we both believe in creation by God. When it comes to psychology, we have this same dualism of mind and body. The fact that, yes, we have a brain, but there's something else. There is a mind, there's a spirit. When it comes to ethics, we both have moral absolutes. This is right, this is wrong. Ironically, let me take a little side trip for just a moment. It's interesting to me that Islam, extremely moral in some aspects. And right now, the mainstream media and Hollywood are literally giving them a free pass. And yet, if they take over in the United States of America, guess what one of the first places they would shut down would be? It'd be Hollywood. Because they're not going to put up with that. Now, change the screen and look a little bit deeper, and all of a sudden we start seeing some major differences. When it comes to sociology, Christians believe in traditional marriage. We believe in the home, the church, the state. Not as so for Islam. They believe in polygamy. It is practiced in countries that have passed Sharia law. They also believe in the mosque, the Islamic state. When it comes to law, Christians say divine law first, then laws of the state. They would say, no. Everybody should be under Sharia law. Sharia law being kind of the political arm of this religion. When it comes to politics, we say justice, freedom, order. They say, no. We want Islamic theocracy. That is a global dominance. Comes to economics, we look pretty much the same. That is stewardship of property. When it comes to history, Christians believe in the creation. They believe in the fall of man and the redemption through Jesus Christ. They would say, no, creation, yes, but there's another prophet. The last prophet being Muhammad. So here's what we're going to do. Look at exactly how this belief system has grown, and then I'm going to give you some history about them that I hope you'll remember. Right now, about 42 nations completely Islamic. If you look on the map on the screen, you'll notice primarily in the Middle East, Northern Africa regions. If I blow that area up just a little bit, most of the areas that are outlined in blue are already under Sharia law, meaning Islam is controlling themselves. In fact, in most of the areas that are painted in blue on the screen behind me, it's illegal for me or for you to go over and openly teach the Bible. I think sometimes in America we forget that there really are people being persecuted today for teaching and preaching Jesus Christ. These would be the areas where that is highly the case. Growing quite a bit. In fact, today there's about 1.3 billion Muslims in the world. So obviously, if it's that big, you and I, we need to know a little something about it. What we're going to do is we're going to go all the way back to 570 A.D. 570 A.D., a little baby by the name of Muhammad is born. He is born in a town called Mecca, Saudi Arabia. If you look on the map, you'll notice here you've got the Persian Gulf. This is obviously Saudi Arabia. Mecca is a town very close to the coast, but it's also very much on the trade routes through Saudi Arabia. It's going to be important because that's actually what Muhammad is going to learn. That's going to be his trade. We learn very early on that his father died before birth. His mother died when he was just 6 years of age. This was a young man who was primarily raised by his uncle and his grandfather. They sent him out to do what most young boys were doing at that time, basically learning those caravan routes, the trade routes. So he would go away for days, weeks at a time, journeying up and down, up towards what we call the Holy Lands, back down towards Mecca. Interestingly, this is obviously a warring area, lots of nomadic people moving around all the time. That's what Muhammad would have known. That's the lifestyle he would have been very familiar with. Now, we're at 570 AD. So obviously Christ has already been here. He has risen. Christianity is already here. But there's one problem, and that is the Bible was not translated into Arabic until after 700 AD. Okay, we're in 570. That means for roughly 130 years, there's kind of a void, a vacuum, if you will. And that's what Muhammad's going to step into. He's going to teach these people a totally different type of belief system. So here you've got a little boy. He grows up. All he would have known religiously is worshiping pagan gods, because that's what the people in that area did. Mecca is an interesting city. It's got a black stone. It's actually still there today. Black stone right in the middle of it that people believe have some major religious significance. So year after year, people will come, they'll gather, they'll make a pilgrimage to this area. Back during when Muhammad was alive, all of Saudi Arabia was warring. There was fighting going on. There were people taking over and beating each other up along these trade caravans. But interestingly, Mecca was one place where they knew they could come for peace. They could worship whatever God they had. So here's what I want you to do. Imagine, if you will, for just a moment, all of the southeast of the United States of America, constantly fighting back and forth. Literally every time you get out on the road, you're taking your life in your own hands. But this area, Gainesboro area, there is one place where you can come and have peace. That's where he grew up. Very early in his life, he was selected by a very wealthy widow to manage her caravans. So again, he goes out. He's traveling. That's where he starts to learn pieces of the Bible. He bumps into Jews and Christians along the way, and they share with him, for instance, about Sarah and Abraham, or Noah, the flood. Now, tradition has it that Muhammad was illiterate his entire life, could not read or write. In fact, the Quran, allegedly what he did was he spoke the words to a scribe. And you say, okay, Brad, what's the big deal? The big deal is he got pieces of this book, but he never put the whole thing together. He never realized that there was a scheme of redemption for man that involved Jesus Christ. Now, I point that out to the parents in this room for this purpose, and that is, you better make sure when your kids are going to Bible class every Sunday morning and they're getting a little piece. Maybe they're learning about Daniel in the lion's den, or Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego. They learn all these quote-unquote stories. Folks, we need to make sure that they're getting the big picture, because Muhammad didn't. He starts to learn little pieces that he will eventually incorporate into his holy book, the Quran. Roughly 595 AD, tradition has it that he finally married that rich widow, the lady who he was working for. She pulls him off the caravan routes. They hire someone else, and it's about that time that he goes into a cave on Mount Hira to, quote-unquote, seek spiritual enlightenment. And allegedly, that's when the angel Gabriel came to him and said, you are the last prophet And it's through you that men will be saved. And so supposedly what he starts doing is he starts transcribing to a scribe what the angel said. Interesting. He goes back to his home city of Mecca. And I am going to give him credit where credit's due. He got one thing right. Here were all these people. They were worshiping in peace. They were worshiping whatever pagan god they wanted to worship. And Muhammad comes back and says, whoa, time out, guys. There's only one God. He got that part right. But that's about all he got right. He's trying to convert all of these people to monotheism. He called his God Allah. Now, imagine again, if you will. Remember I said, think about what it would be like if all the southeast of America were fighting and warring, but Gainesboro was one place of peace. And in comes Muhammad, and he starts stirring that up. And he takes this one place where everybody knew they could come and do their own thing, and now he's starting to kind of stick his finger in the beehive, so to speak. They didn't like it. In fact, the Jews, they rejected him. They wanted to know, okay, if you're the last prophet, if you're the Messiah, do a miracle. In fact, they ridiculed him for his lack of knowledge of the Bible. He knew some of the accounts in the Bible that he'd learned on the caravan routes, but quite literally, this was a guy who did not know the Scripture. And so what did they do? Here you've got a man that is stirring up the pot. They quite literally sent him packing. A couple of 100 miles north to a city called Medina. And folks, that is the 0 year for Islam. That's when it started. He goes to Medina. He's mad. He wants to build up his religion, so he does it the only way he knows how. And that is through those caravan routes. He builds it up, quite literally, through the tip of a sword. What he did was he would go out and with his little band of merry men, they would have their swords, and basically the message was either you convert or we'll kill you. And anytime there were fighting going on, they would take whatever those people had. If they came across a caravan that would not convert, they would slay them. They would then take their women, their children, and all their goods. And they began to grow. In fact, word spread pretty quickly. Hey, if you're going to be going through this particular caravan route, you want to go ahead and join these people, because otherwise they're going to kill you. Most businessmen realize, hey, this is going to be a lot more profitable for us to be one of them than to fight them. Kind of like the Chicago mob. You've seen the Hollywood pictures where they go in, they go into a pizza shop, and the guy, he reaches in the cash register and he hands the guy a couple of $100 for protecting his store. Well, that's kind of what was going on here. You need to either join us or pay the consequences. And so they started growing exponentially, because all along these trade routes, what was happening was people were joining this fraternity, this club. They got very, very adept at fighting in the desert. And all of a sudden, they numbered into the thousands. And then they numbered into the tens of thousands. And Muhammad realized he finally had enough people, enough followers to do what he really wanted to do. And that is to return back to Mecca. That was his home. He wanted to be there. He wanted to turn that into the headquarters for Islam. So they go back. They get rid of all of these people who were worshiping pagan gods. In fact, they did it literally through the tip of a sword. They convert it into the headquarters for Islam. That's in roughly 630 AD. So, think with me for just a minute. 630 AD, he comes back. They set up their headquarters. The Quran is now finished. He's got his works. In 632, he died. He'd only been back 2 years. And folks, listen to me. That belief system came within literally a hair's breadth of going away forever. You see, Muhammad never appointed his heir. He never said, If I die, here's going to be the next person. And so very soon after his death, there became infighting. Two groups. Most of you in here have heard of both of these groups. You hear on the news about the Sunnis or the Shiites. These are divisions of Islam. The Sunnis believe that the most capable man, the man who is the best leader, should lead Islam. Whereas the Shiites say, no, it's got to come through his lineage. They began to fight, fraction off, war with each other. You say, okay, Brad, exactly what are the differences between us and them? Well, let's look at a couple very quickly. If we were to look at our book versus their book, interesting, the Bible says we've got everything we need. You don't add to it, you don't take away from it, right? In fact, it teaches about a God who loved us so much, he sent his only begotten Son. The Quran was added much after the fact. In fact, they don't just use one book. Those of you who studied Islam, you know they really use three. They've got another book called the Hadiths. What are the Hadiths? The Hadiths are basically folks who wrote down everything that Muhammad did because they felt like, hey, if our prophet did it, then it's acceptable. And so they have multiple books that they follow. You look at the two key players. You've got one who is able to perform miracles, one who is able to conquer death, one who's able to give forgiveness. The other one, quite literally, he starts his religion through violence. I always like to tell the young people, you look at those two, please understand, every single year, millions and millions and millions of Muslims, they go to Mecca to pay homage to where Muhammad is buried. They do a pilgrimage. I don't have anywhere to go. And what I mean by that is the bones of Jesus Christ are not somewhere we can visit because he conquered death. You look at God versus Allah. God being a God who desires all men to be saved. Loved us so much he sent his Son. He had a plan from the very beginning for the church. And then you look at Allah, a God who wants infidels killed, who is a God who is very demanding, who wants works out of his people. You compare the way we grow. Christians are supposed to grow, the Bible tells us, through evangelism, teaching the truth to our neighbors, our friends, and our family. They grew through what's called jihad, holy war. You say, okay, what exactly is this holy war? Basically, holy war is what they consider to be legitimate warring or fighting against anybody who does not accept Allah. So you say, okay, Brad, I hear what you're saying, but why are we focusing so much energy on them? On the screen behind me, there is a verse out of their holy book. Notice what it says. He it is who sent his messenger, that he may cause Islam to prevail over all religions. One of the things that I hope you will remember is these are a people who ultimately want global dominance. They're not just wanting to grow. You know, when a Baptist denomination builds a church building down the road, they're wanting to grow. But they're not wanting to take over the world. And by force, if they have to, this is a belief system that does. So, if you think about it for just a moment, you got blood from two different perspectives. You got the blood from jihad and the blood from Jesus Christ. Two totally different ways to look at it. Christianity began and spread through evangelism. Islam began and spread through violence. In the Bible, salvation is promised to those who obey the gospel, whereas Islam guarantees paradise to martyrs who fight for their cause. I had the opportunity to talk to a gentleman who was converted out of Islam to Christianity, and he told me, he said, Brad, you guys don't get it. He said, Americans are trying to put an American worldview on Muslims. He said it'll never work. Because you guys hear about somebody strapping a bomb to themselves, going into a pizza restaurant, blowing everybody up. And you think, wow, that guy's crazy. But over there, all the people can think is, he just won his ticket to paradise. Because you see, the only way they know for sure is if they die in service to Allah. Totally different way of looking at things. Christianity, religion of the grace of God, whereas Islam is a religion of works. Now, what exactly do they believe or practice? If you were to visit their mosque, what would you observe? Let's look real quickly at the 5 pillars of Islam. This is kind of the basic tenets of the belief. Number 1, everybody is expected to say a creed. Number 2, 5 daily prayers oriented towards Mecca. Number 3, almsgiving, that is, giving of their means. Number 4, fasting during the Islamic month of Ramadan. And number 5, every able body is expected to make a pilgrimage to Mecca at least once in their life. Now, look at these a little bit closer. Number 1, that creed. They are to announce verbally in front of people they believe in one God, Allah, and that Muhammad is Allah's prophet. The same gentleman who had converted out of Islam, he brought a textbook. And we were talking, and during our discussion, he opened it up. He said, read that. I looked on the textbook, and I started reading. And it was very similar to the history book that I showed you earlier. It had a portion in it that was bolded the kids were supposed to read with their teacher. He said, Brad, that's the creed. He said, your kids are saying the Islamic creed out loud, and they don't even know it. Second step is they are supposed to pray 5 times a day. Now, we think that just means they're supposed to maybe get on this mat. And actually, it's very, very formal. They've got to wash themselves in a specific way before they're to recite certain things. In fact, the word mosque itself actually means a place of prostration. So here you've got these folks who are praying 5 times a day. It really bothers me that in America today, we've done everything we can to get prayer out of schools. And yet, you know what we're now building in some of our schools? Prayer rooms for Islam. Folks, listen to me. That's messed up. Not only that, we're now looking at adding some of their holidays to our kids' school vacation. Every single one of their prayers begins the same way. This is basically one of the opening chapters out of their Quran, the holy book. It starts out, in the name of God, the merciful, the compassionate, praise belongs to God, the Lord of all beings. And if you've ever heard this being said, you'll hear that kind of almost an eerie chant. I was over in London this past year, and they had their call to prayer. And you could walk down the sidewalks of London, and you could hear, quite literally, hundreds of men chanting the same thing in this kind of a monotone chant. By the way, if you know anything about traveling, you know that Friday is the day when overseas, usually their security level is raised. The reason being, Friday is their Sunday, so to speak. It's their day of worship. It's their day to gather in the mosque together. So imagine, if you will, they bring in 200-300 folks. They get them riled up about infidels and the fact that infidels should either convert or be killed. And all of a sudden, you know, you're out there on the sidewalk. You've got your Made in the USA t-shirt and Nikon camera, and they walk out and they see he's an infidel. Number 3, they are to give of their means. Now, I've done a lot of looking to try to figure out exactly how much or what. Only thing that I can glean for sure is they are only supposed to give to Islamic works. But as far as a percentage, that's one of those that's kind of hard to nail down. They are supposed to fast during the month of Islamic or Ramadan. Ramadan is allegedly the time in which the Quran was handed down. So from sunup to sundown, during that entire month, they're not supposed to eat. I always have to point out, it's kind of ironic to me, you know, they fast when they're guy supposedly got this particular holy book. It seems like in the church we can't come together unless we do what? Just think about it. Fifth pillar, they are expected to take that pilgrimage to Mecca. What is it that I want to share with you to kind of wake you up this morning? I've got about 7 more minutes. I want to share with you what the mainstream media is not sharing. You know, we're being told that this is a peaceful religion, that it's a good thing, we ought to look into it. And yet, if you look at it through the eyes of, say, a woman, you open up their holy book, take a look. Quran, Surah, chapter 24, verse 33 says, "Do not force your slave girls into prostitution in order that you may enrich yourselves." First thing to point out, they've got slave girls. They think it's all right. They go on to say, if they, that is the slave girls, wish to preserve their chastity. You think, okay, well, that's good. They're not at least going to force these slave girls into prostitution. But their Bible goes on to say, if anyone, that is a slave owner, compels these chastity-choosing slave girls to be a prostitute, Allah is all forgiving and most merciful. In other words, don't do it, but if you do, Allah will forgive you. It'll be okay. You see, this is a belief system that buys into the idea of concubines, slaves, multiple wives. You say, why would that be? Remember, Muhammad was kicked out of Mecca, packing up to Medina. On that occasion, one of his followers gave Muhammad as a gift his 6-year-old daughter to be his second wife. Now, tradition has it that he didn't consummate the marriage until she was 9, but folks, I would point out, she was 9. And all of a sudden, polygamy was born into this belief system. You say, but Brad, there's polygamy in the Bible, and you're right, there is. But let me ask you, did God ever put his stamp of approval on that? No, he didn't. You say, okay, how did he get away with it? How does Muhammad defend polygamy? Well, take a look. I mean, if you're writing the book yourself or verbally speaking it, here's what he says. O prophet, we have made lawful for you your wives to whom you have paid their dowries, the slave girls whom your right hand possesses, whom Allah has given to you. This privilege for you only, not for the rest of the believers. You, O Muhammad, you may receive whom you will. And whomsoever you desire, of those whom you have set aside, it is no sin on you. In other words, you can do it. In fact, as I mentioned, this is a religion that promotes having concubines. It says, except with their wives and the women slaves whom their right hand possesses. Remember, part of the way that they grew was they went out, they conquered these caravans coming down the trade routes. Well, anytime they would conquer a caravan, the men got to keep the women and the children. Goes on to say, and if you fear that you should not be able to deal justly with orphan girls, then marry women of your choice, 2 or 3 or 4 of them. Notice it doesn't start with one. And yet the Bible says in Hebrews 13:4, marriage is honorable among all, the bed undefiled, fornicators, adulterers, God will judge. Every nation that you looked at on that map that was blue, it's under Sharia law, they used that passage that I just read as justification for having 4 wives. You say, okay, Brad, so what's the big deal? Here's part of the big deal. Britain is not technically under Sharia law, but last year they passed Sharia law for all the Muslims, meaning they get to self-govern now. So those men who practice that religion can have 4 wives. You say, yes, so what? Dearborn Park, Michigan just asked for the same thing here in the States. Now imagine, if you will, what kind of insanity that's going to do to our legal system. You say, how is this happening? Basically, here's what was going on. Every time they would go out, these unsuspecting caravans would be taken captive. Now, interestingly, all the way up through 1991, they were still practicing slavery. Open slavery. Those of you who really know your history know in northern Africa, there's still slavery going on. Here's what really is interesting. I want you to do some homework. Everybody in here learned about the Civil War and slavery in America. You know what you didn't learn about? Where we got our slaves from. Islam. Oh, I can document it. They came from northern Africa, the slave routes over to North America. Interesting. I'm not a feminist, but it's interesting to me. This is a belief system that treats women like animals, and yet in America, our feminists are not speaking up. Oh, they'll speak out against Christianity being a male privileging religion, but they don't speak out against Islam, a religion that quite literally is treating women like property. You say, how did they get to this point? Well, remember, if you will, Muhammad makes a promise to all of his followers. Anytime we take over a caravan, you get to keep the stuff. The guys thought, hey, that's great. But they realized that occasionally some of the men would die in battle. They would get killed. And so that's when Muhammad made a promise that literally is being followed and believed by millions of men, Muslims today. And that is, if you die in service to Allah, there'll be virgins waiting for you in heaven. And folks, listen. What he ultimately did was he turned heaven into a brothel. Because it's no longer about God, it's about earthly pleasure. Now, I wish that I had at least another 30 minutes to share with you some of the other issues that are going on. But let me close by saying this. What do we do? Number one, we have the truth. And those people do have souls. And so you and I need to look for opportunities to ask them questions. Why, for instance, why do you guys think it's okay to have 4 wives? Why do you think it should take 2 women's testimony in a court against 1 man's? Ask them some of the inconsistencies. Number 2, we need to talk to our friends and our neighbors and our coworkers about this belief system. We need to hold our elected officials accountable, because this is not just a religion. As I mentioned, this is a political movement. Ultimately, we need to remind ourselves and our neighbors that Jesus Christ said, He is the way, the truth, the life. No one comes to the Father except through who? Through Him. Appreciate very, very much y'all's attention this morning. We will get ready for worship together. Thank you.